All right, so Justin asked that we sort of kick things off, Michael and I, and I was just going to give a little bit of a intro here. Skipped one. There we go. That's the three of us. Christian was supposed to be here too, but he got stuck at the office doing contracts, so we can keep the doors open. We were founded in 2006 with just the three of us, and now we're roughly about five. Given that we're also a street gang by night, so watch out. I was going to just do two things. The first one's really fast. Justin just asked that because the series is on entrepreneurship that I just at least touch a little bit on our startup story, and then we'll talk about small lot subdivision. Our startup, we started telling the story of our startup a lot to young people, students that would come and ask to meet with us. And what we ended up doing after a while was, not that we didn't like not meeting with people, but we eventually decided to make it a series of blog posts that have been pretty popular. And so I'm not going to really get into this because it's not really the focus of today, but if you have an interest in kind of learning our sort of startup story or thinking about starting your own company, and it doesn't have to be architecture, I don't think there's probably a lot of architects here, but I think for any small company, I think we learned some valuable lessons and we just wanted to share them with everybody. So if you just go to our blog, find 7 tips for starting an architecture firm, you can kind of learn a little bit about some of our things, which are a little bit off base, I think, from kind of the textbook kind of things you read about as far as starting a small company. The only other thing I wanted to touch on is that when we started Modative, we actually never called it Modative Architecture, and typically we still don't. Our tagline was actually design, develop, build, with the goal of eventually getting to the point where we're not just designing, which is our background, being 3 architecture school grads, but building the projects ourselves and then eventually developing them. We've basically covered 2 of the 3, and this year we're hoping to get into our first development project. It's taken a while, but we're working on it. Okay, so keeping with the entrepreneurial theme, we were going to tie in sort of talking about a series of small lot subdivision projects that we've worked on and sort of tying it in a little bit to kind of our story and tied to the economy because they're all very closely related in So small lot subdivision was founded actually about a year and 2 months before we started our office. And in general, and we're going to get into a bunch of examples and you'll see a bunch of different sites where we've either laid out or had fully entitled small lot projects and some built. But in general, the idea was to take smaller lots or even larger lots in LA with certain types of zoning, and instead of doing a typical condo, you would actually subdivide the land into very, very tiny lots so that when you sell them, they're fee simple. And there's, in a lot of the smaller cases, you end up with no homeowners association. And so when someone buys it from you, they're actually buying it with the land and typically not an extensive set of fees and rules that you would have with a typical condo project. And there's a lot of little intricacies, but we'll sort of get to them. So we started our office in 2006. Which this is the Dow Jones, and we thought that was a great time to be starting an office, but it was actually a terrible time to start an office because there was this sort of false sense of things happening. But fortunately for us, we caught a little bit of that wave in the beginning, and this was a period of time. Who was in the real estate business in 2006? Raise your hand, please. Okay, so most of you were, and you know what was happening. What we found was happening, which was to our advantage, was that, we started our office, we had no projects, we had no clients, we just kind of started one day. We're like, all right, now what do we do? And we had various different types of background, but the one thing we found is that in 2006, everyone wanted to be a real estate developer. Mom and pops, friends of ours, family, their parents, everyone, which worked out great because a lot of them would say, hey, I know you guys just started an architecture firm, I have this property, what can I do with it? And really quickly, we learned that for a lot of these properties, the only thing you could do was small lot subdivision. And so we started doing these basic feasibility studies for them. And what was funny is we really didn't know what we were doing, but we tried to pretend like we knew what we were doing. And I remember a couple of those first visits to the city where we would go down there and we would ask someone in the planning department. We'd go to all the different departments and we would ask them about small lot subdivision. And unfortunately, what we learned really quickly is that we knew more than them about the ordinance because we'd actually read it. And that was really kind of how small lots started in LA. It did not start out with a bang. It started out very, very slowly. The first few projects were all, we weren't involved in the first few projects, but they were mostly rehabbing existing buildings. They're great projects, but so a lot of the issues took years and years to really work out in the system. And I think it's only in the last few years that I think it's become at least a little bit streamlined. So we were doing a lot of these feasibility studies, and even though we didn't really know what we were doing, fortunately we ended up talking people out of a lot of projects because we realized that most of them didn't make sense. But we probably did about a dozen of these feasibility studies, and in the process really started to learn a little bit more about the ordinance with each one. And then this led to really our first small lot subdivision project that we worked on. And interestingly enough, it's probably still to this day the most unique one that we worked on, in that it was on a major boulevard and really lent itself to live work. It's actually where our office is now, which tells you what happened to the project. So, this was an interesting one of the diagrams we made when we first started it, and I think it's really important because what we found in most of the projects we worked on is that obviously small lots only in the city of LA, but there's a lot of, as you know, as residents of LA, there's a lot of these great amenities in adjacent cities to LA. And what we found is that a lot of developers have picked up on this, and we think some of the most successful projects are ones where you find a property in the city of LA, but yet really close to something with a lot of amenities, in this case Culver City. This is right near Helms Bakery, so there's a lot of restaurants and bars and galleries, cafes, things like that. So this was the design of it. I mean, remember, this is about 2007, so this was absolutely overly ambitious compared to today. But we learned some interesting things in this first one that this one actually did get all the way entitled, and we actually were very close to pulling a building permit before we canned it. But in this one, what was interesting is we tried to give all 6 units access to Venice Boulevard so that they could be truly like a live-work space. And so we started to learn about how the easements worked, where you can use an easement. Can you guys still hear me if I get up here? You can still use an easement on this person's property to give someone access to their front door, and then vice versa. From the alley, this person can have an easement on their lot to access their parking from the alley. And so it created kind of this interesting little site plan that we still think is one of the most unique ones that we've still worked on to date. So this is just a little cut through the building, and so the idea was that there was a workspace on the ground floor and then living up above, so a 4-story building. And then in the back, this one a little bit smaller workspace, but then 2 stories of living up above it. And this is another view of the project. So off the momentum of that one, we did one just a couple blocks away. There was 7 units. This was more of a traditional residential. It was between Venice and Washington. And this was sort of your very typical, pretty simple site plan with 3-bedroom, 3.5 baths in the front, and 2-bedroom, 2.5 baths in the rear. And this next one is a little bit sad. So this is what happened, 2008 happened, and with it, both of these projects went bye-bye, just like that. And so while we were having this momentum with small lot, it basically came to a halt completely. And not much really happened for about a year or so. But then something started to happen, which I think has been in some level occurring since then. But this one was very unique in that it was probably our only project, or only small lot project, for at least a year to year and a half. And what happened is people started to realize that they could get property for really cheap. And so someone went out with 0 development experience and bought this property, Googled small lot subdivision, found us, came into our office, and there we had a project in the middle of the recession, which is probably the only reason we're even still here. So I always tend to thank this client for keeping our office afloat. And so this is a 3-unit project. I think what's interesting about this one is that it's your very typical lot in Los Angeles. It's 50 feet wide by 120 feet deep. And in this case, you could put 4 on this, and there's a lot of great examples of people putting 4 on this, but because it was the heart of the recession, he was very cautious with spending money on this, so kept it to 3 units. But what happens here is you obviously, you divide it into 3, and then where the orange is roughly, you start to create easements for driveways and things. And that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but that's how a lot of these infill ones tend to lay out. I think what's really unique about this one is that it's a pretty typical layout, but it's literally adjacent to West Hollywood on 2 sides. So once again, this is a pretty high-end area, and so it affords certain things. So this one went up to 4 stories with some nice roof decks. Here's the plan on that. But it's also, a lot of times, these things are really crammed in, and you really have to utilize space well to make them work. Here's a shot of it. It's on Crescent Heights in Romaine. And this is currently in the city and going to public hearing.
And this one here is on Cardiff. It's pretty close to Culver City. It's kind of in the same neighborhood as this, probably about a mile and a half away. This is a 3-unit small lot subdivision. Interesting about this neighborhood is it's adjacent to a preschool, and it's also a neighborhood that is approved right now with a lot of large apartment buildings. So it's kind of able to take advantage of a little bit more height. This one's also 4 stories like the one on Crescent Heights. And this project has 3 residential units. It's got a 35-foot building line in the front, so it allowed that front unit to have a pretty large private yard and kind of activate the street.
So we actually got a chance to go back and take a look at these 2 first projects that we had again, and realized that there was still an opportunity for them. And so both of them actually have been sort of reincarnated in different forms. The Venice Boulevard one we just started, so we don't have any pictures of it yet, but and Fay Avenue one we actually had just started, had started a couple years ago and just finished phase 1. And so both of them have become sort of these phased rental that will then become a small lot subdivision after. So that's another interesting kind of twist to it, as well as the idea of doing them as rentals and then phasing them, or, I mean, there's a lot of different variations that you can come up with on these. So I'll let you talk about this one.
So I think on this one, one of the challenges of this one was exactly what he was talking about, is of the 3 lots that were part of the original project, the lot in the middle was a vacant piece of land. And so a vacant piece of land basically generates no income. So the concept for this one was to take it phase by phase so that the developer could basically not have to use a bank and then still have the opportunities as a small lot subdivision. So basically what we did is we came up with a plan that would allow it to be phased without the small lot subdivision ordinance, and in the end you can record it as a small lot subdivision. Both of those projects that he mentioned, the one on Venice and the one on Fay, the original map is still active, so you can actually do a modification to that map as part of the process. So this was the phase 1. There were 2 units. It was nicknamed the 2-by homes because there were 2 units, basically 2 window types, 2 layouts for the plans, 2 door types. So it was kind of a way of breaking the design down to kind of a simple element so that they could work as rentals.